everyone. Celeste, what is behind you?
It's just like a tapestry that my cousin gave me.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice. It like halos your head. Okay. We're not gonna go the whole time this lecture. We'll just finish up all the thermal stuff. And then on Wednesday, we'll transition into, it's Wednesday today. On Friday, we'll transition into cold. And I think next week is our last week before spring break. So I haven't looked at the voting yet, what you guys have or haven't voted on of when to do the test. So the options, if you feel like re-voting before I look, go for it. But the options would be the test will just cover the what we've been talking about this whole time, right? So through cold adaptation, which isn't as thorough as heat adaptation. Heat adaptation we're much better at. Uh, Adapting to cold weathers, we don't really adapt that much. Not that much happens. There's a few cool things, the hunter's effect and stuff that we'll talk about, but thermal adaptations, heat adaptation is a lot more comprehensive, and it's just going to take two, maybe three lectures to go through the cold stuff. So at the end of the cold stuff, we'll do the test. If you want to just spend Friday doing a review session, or if you want to just get the test out of the way, just let me know. Whatever it is. If you've already voted and you're not changing your mind, that's fine too. Today, we're just going to wrap up the thermal fizz stuff. Chat box is open. Okay, you know all of this. And I will put together a slideshow that is just checklist of stuff to know that includes the previous to all of our thermal fizz when we're doing specificity of adaptation and the nature and breadth of stresses and how we adapt and what accommodation looks like and adaptation looks like and sensitization and habituation and all of that stuff. I will include those review slides, and I'll make a, a comprehensive review slide thing, and I can post that. But you know all of these things that deal with heat stress, the specificity of warm up, the pre-cooling, the 1% is sufficient, but 2%, 3%, we're getting a lot more compromising. Doesn't have to be high intensity. Um, these different solutions, right? What the solution is relative to what the cell is, if it's hypo or hypertonic, isotonic, right? So that's a nice equilibrium there. When osmolality gets a little bit off, death is the consequence. And so we try to constantly preserve that. And probably the best drink is just water and well, I don't know why we need all the food coloring in there, but water and Gatorade, sort of a hybrid of the two. Sweating, remember, we're going to lose more fluid than, even though sweat is salty, it's not as salty, right? The concentration of electrolytes is not as high as your blood. And so the first thing that happens is we're going to get extracellular dehydration. But then, as we lose fluid but retain some of our electrolytes, we're going to follow with intracellular dehydration, where the actual fluid departs the cell to go to the blood. Where we sense these things, a couple of brain areas that are out in the, not like periphery, but I mean they're in the brain, but they're exposed to circulation. They're exposed to the blood. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, the kidneys long-term, longish term regulation over blood pressure. And whenever regulation gets a little bit haywire, whenever its wires get a little bit like hairy, it can become chronic. We can see chronic elevations in blood pressure when the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is misbehaving a little bit. You know what a nephron is, that functional unit of the kidney. You got a million of those per, and that's where we're deciding. That's the St. Peter of the kidney, where it's at the pearly gates, saying the pearly gates of the nephron, saying you're going to hell, which is the toilet. It means we're going to pee you out. Electrolytes and water, hydration, and or it's saying, okay, you stay up here with us, heaven in the body, whatever. So the sort of the St. Peter, that's we're in the nephron tubules making decisions, and all these, vasopressin and atrial natriuretic peptide. I mean, these things are affecting the nephron, determining hydration status, and eating and drinking, right? Eating and drinking are going to affect our thirst. It's going to affect our regulatory behavior before any of that fluid, before osmolality actually changes in a meaningful way. Our desire to drink, our thirst, our behavior is going to change. And so it's just the body's way of saying, all right, we know that um, food is coming, which is going to change our osmolality, or fluid is coming, which is going to change our osmolality. And so let's alter our behavior knowing what's about to happen. Rehydration takes time, right? Rehydration takes time. And as you get up here, if you go over this, it doesn't really seem to enhance much more. It seems to have this same slope. If you kind of go up here, up here, up here, you seem to have the same amount of kind of fluid exodus from your stomach. The gastric emptying doesn't seem to be enhanced when you go over 600 or so milliliters. You get really high and maybe it slows it down, but it certainly is not helping when you go over that. But you hit that 600 or so, that's kind of the magic point. And increase the osmolality, increase the amount of carbohydrate in the drink, and you can slow this down. You can slow down gastric emptying, but you're going to increase the absorption of carbs. And it just, the time signature, 5-10 minutes, and you can start seeing some of this water getting into your sweat, right? So that's what we're seeing here, that deuterium oxide. At the 10-minute mark, it's like, yeah, we're at the back, we're at the forehead, we're seeing some of this appearing in the sweat after consumption. Just set a 10-minute kitchen timer, and you can see the time course of that water arriving in the sweat gland. So it is kind of fast, but it's not like 100% of it is there, right? Those are the first soldiers to cross the finish line, the first droplets of that water that you drank to arrive on the surface. It's not like you fully emptied your stomach and the intestines, and all of that water is now where it's supposed to be. That's just the initial appearance of it. There is a time course, and that time course depends, of course, on what you're eating and what you're drinking, and are you exercising, the nature of the exercise. What it doesn't seem to depend on is pH and temperature, stuff like that. That doesn't really seem to matter. The type of exercise probably doesn't matter much. Now, it might affect your sweat rate, and your sweat rate might more terminally, more eventually affect your thermoregulation, and thermoregulation might affect gastric emptying. Okay, yeah, there may be a domino effect to to impair gastric emptying. If different sports have different sweat rates, and sweat rate, as you know, is going to correspond to different thermoregulation capacities, and the consequence of that you might see in a much more long term, in the duration of a marathon or something like that. Maybe you're going to see some compromise in that sense. Or if the sport is super sloshy, you're just doing tumbling, you're doing somersaults for as long as you can go. I mean, just miles of somersaults or something like that. Okay, yeah, maybe there's contexts in which, or if it's like a jumping sport and you just jump in the whole time. Sure, maybe there's a an amount of physical activity or the nature of the sport that can determine difference. But the VO2 max, the percentage, the intensity, the aerobic intensity, the percentage of your VO2 max, that's a determinant. um, I'll show you what study found 40%, really low, 40% of VO2 max, and you start getting over that, and maybe there's a tiny bit of compromise, but 70, 80% of VO2 max, that's really where people are finding compromise in water absorption, pretty high intensity. It could be as low as 40%, but that's not found by everybody. But the grazing, right, get up there to between 4 and 600, and just start gulping, start grazing as you go. Just, every minute have your little gulp and keep going. And cutting weight, this is where we began on Monday. Just be cognizant, right? Be aware of the conditions of performance and how cutting weight, whether it's hydration or fat or muscle or whatever it is, whatever your weight is, usually this is hydration fluctuations. That's what a lot of weight is. I mean, you see wrestlers, elite wrestlers, not just like go to middle school and, yeah, pick out a kid at random, but elite wrestlers tend to have this camel-like ability to kind of store and deplete water. Um, but what is the performance detriment that they experience? I haven't seen literature specifically on elite wrestlers and their capacities while well hydrated, while hydrated, and while dehydrated. I haven't seen that study. It probably exists. I bet some study or some approximation of that study exists. It's just not one that I've seen yet. But for most people in most circumstances, you are going to perform worse if you cut weight. No, I'm not talking, you're in the off season and you've decided for the last 3 months, you've just been like a lazy slob who hasn't gotten out of bed, and like, oh, I got like 50 pounds of fat to lose or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you're sort of in training weight. If you're fit to your sport, you're athletically prepared, and your frame, your physique, your form, all of this is in a quote fit state. You're ready to endure the stresses of your sport. And from there you cut weight. From there you deplete body weight, generally to make a weight class, sometimes to be have a power to weight ratio advantage. Whatever the goal is, what we see in most people, in most circumstances, most sports, is a deterioration of performance. I know I feel it whenever I cut weight. If I'm being consistent in the weight room or something, and I can tell, I know what my exercises are, they just tank. Those exercises tank, and trying to preserve those despite cutting weight gets a little bit difficult. Now, cutting fat, you're looking more at strength. Cutting hydration, you're looking more at endurance. If you cut a little bit of hydration, your peak power output isn't really going to change. Your ability to put the shot, or do a vertical jump or whatever, that's not really going to change. But you see something like wrestling, boxing, running, obviously running, but cycling, obviously that too. All of those things are going to be impaired by cutting weight. So understanding what the advantage would be if you want to come in strong, powerful, and high endurance, or if you want to go against weaker people. Just decide where you want to be in the weight class. I wouldn't cut so much to squeeze and narrowly into a weight class you really don't belong in, because then you're just unathletic compared to your baseline. But as long as you know what you're doing, you can make an informed decision that's going to be better than what I would say. My advice, your advice is going to be better because you'll know what your baseline is, how much of a deterioration you're going to endure by cutting, and is that deterioration going to put you at a disadvantage, or does the advantage of going down a weight class overpower the disadvantage of endurance and stuff like this? You'll know your body, you'll know the conditions of your sport better than I would, but as long as you know the information, how this stuff works. Now, this is the Florian Lang stuff, cell volume and how important cell volume is. I'll upload to Canvas one of Florian Lang's, the next paper, this one. I'll upload this to Canvas because it's a really good, comprehensive, the most thorough paper I've ever seen on this subject is this one. And it's a little bit old now, but man, it's a really good one. And the subsequent papers that talk about this will usually look at a slice. They'll take a sliver and evaluate that. This one took the globe. I mean, most of them take, a zip code and like, okay, let's evaluate this. And this one's just like, all right, let's take the globe and we'll just get everything on the map. So it's a really comprehensive paper. But the effect of cell volume, swelling or shrinking, is, are we in a um, hydrated or dehydrated environment? What intracellular, extracellular hydration status? If intracellular hydration is low, what is that going to do to gene expression? Lots of changes, right? So you see cell shrinking and cell swelling, and what that's going to do. You don't need to know any of these specific things. What I'm doing here is just saying, oh, wow, is it vast? That's all you need to know. Wow, is it vast? And tons of metabolic functions are going to be affected just by the state of cell swelling or cell shrinking. So what the actual volume looks like, tons more. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on with all of these biological functions, tons of metabolic functions affected just by the state of the cells, how hydrated those cells are. Now, we know that the rate of fluid loss, you're an athlete exercising in the heat. If you're not an athlete, I don't know, a liter and a half every hour, something like that. If you're just, you're like a 25-year-old who's never really exercised, but you're out, doing something in the heat, and you're like weeding the yard or whatever, and like, oh, maybe a liter and a half and over the hour or something like that. That's still a lot of fluid. But you become athletic, you become a competitive athlete, and now you're exercising in the heat, and you're looking at 2 to 3 liters every hour, depending on the level of athleticism, depending on how hot it is, depending on your exertion, depending on a lot of things. And that this Alberto Salazar study down here, Armstrong study, he was at 3.71 liters per hour. That's a lot. Right, that is a lot. And especially if you start to get behind, it's really hard to catch up. You kind of can't do it, right? Because there's a maximum rate of uptake. Now, that maximum rate of uptake, there's ways to get around it. We're like, well, let's not get a bunch of solute in there. Let's keep the carbs really low, maybe 2%, 1.5%, 2% carbs, something like that. And let's get up to 600 milliliters and just try to graze our way there to try to keep it there, to keep it at 600 milliliters. But these maximal rates of emptying, they aren't much. It's not that fast. And so this little kid sips somewhere between 6 and 24 milliliters. And so this sip a minute rate That's a fine rate for emptying and to get those sips into the sweat, but you can't just gulp and gulp and gulp and hope it does something other than slosh around in your stomach. But again, volume matters. You get to 200, you get to 400, you get to 600 milliliters, and you're emptying faster. I do pour over for coffee, and because I just control exactly how much I'm making and the concentration of everything, and if you've ever done pour over, what you do if you just put a little bit of water in here, I mean, just put like an ounce of water in here and it drips really slowly. That 1 ounce exits here. I mean, it's just like every minute there's a drip. I mean, put in like 6 ounces, put in 8 ounce. I mean, just put more and more water in the coffee and it's going to exit faster until the water level gets low again and it drips slowly. That's the same thing. That's gastric emptying. That's absorption of your fluids. Get a bunch in there and your pour over drips faster. Your stomach is emptying faster. The water is being absorbed from your intestine, from your small intestine faster, usually more proximal. The duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, the small intestine, the sections. The more proximal duodenal you are, the more you're going to be absorbing. But really just cram in that water, put a lot of water in the pour over coffee machine. It's going to drip faster. There's a lot of water in here. It's dripping fast. When it goes down, let's say this is a stomach right here. And right now it's a 600 mLs. And so it's dripping fast. But it gets down to 400, it's dripping slower. It gets down to 200, it's dripping slower. It gets down to 100, and it's like not really dripping anymore. It gets down to 50. So it's the same thing for the stomach. Now, a ton of water, and it's not really helping much. Now, what does 600 mLs look like? So if I say get 600 mLs in your stomach and then try to sip and stay around 400 or something like that, your Coke can, that's 355. According to my Google search, how many milliliters in a can of Coke? 355. That's a .edu webpage. UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, maybe. So let's just say that's probably right. Right, so 355 mLs in a can of Coke, and so that's you get a little bit more than a can of Coke in you, and you're going to be emptying somewhat rapidly, certainly readily. And if you get that carbohydrate content, in that Gatorade zone, there's a measurable effect on gastric emptying. This is that slide that I was referencing at the end of last lecture, where how do you calculate this? So take a screenshot if you want to calculate it. I'll get it uploaded, tonight or tomorrow or something like that. I'll get these uploaded. But this is the formula. If you're looking at a sports drink or a non-sports drink, I don't really know what qualifies a drink of being a sport, just like a sports bar. Is anybody playing a sport in the bar? No, they're like sitting there, getting drunk, eating like terrible food, watching a television. What kind of sport is that, right? So sports drinks to me are the equivalent of the sports bar. Certainly they're not sports, and they're not usually used in sporting contexts. Better solutions are available for this. That said, Gatorade does sponsor a lot of research, a lot of thermal regulation and hydration research, and some of it is quite sound. They do contribute, they do fund and contribute to science. And so there is a round of applause to be had. But the bottom line is the dollar, and who wants to buy some terrible tasting thing at S-Mart or Safeway or something. It's really, a lot of these drinks are just for people who want to not feel bad about themselves as they drink the equivalent of like slightly lower calorie orange juice or something. Like, no, I'm an athlete. What are you talking about? So the osmolality of the beverage is going to matter. Acute peripheral dehydration can result. Now, matters of severity. It's not like, well, the drink, the osmolality was 300, and so I'm going to be a horrible athlete for a while. That's not really how this works. But you get that osmolality up, and it's not initially hydrating because you're going to call water to your intestines uh, to find a balance, right? To find this isotonic balance, and most of these drinks, when you look at them, so it's the the small intestine, you're like 270, 290 or so. It also depends on what you've been eating, and but so you go over that, and that's when you're going to start to see the possibility of peripheral dehydration. And these are just most of them are going over. Now there's some that, well, whatever the Rivi Marathon, I don't know, 210 for some powder, but according to the what it says in the instructions, mix 1 scoop into 8 ounces of water or whatever. Um, the osmolality would be 210. But a lot of these are over, and some of them get pretty far over, and that's not really that good of a sports drink, an athletically augmenting, a performance augmenting drink. And the exercise intensities, it's this one down here, that found the 40%, as low as 40% had a detectable effect on absorption, on fluid absorption. But in general, the nature of all of these studies, you're looking at 70 plus percent of your VO2 max when you're really seeing a detriment to the absorption. And it's hard to maintain that intensity for an especially long duration. So it's really okay, but if you are doing high intensity interval training, pay particular attention to your hydration, because it can be a little bit harder to get gastric emptying and fluid absorption in those sorts of environments as compared to steady state environments. So just being aware of that. Coffee, remember, we're looking at the Eddy and Downs paper from 1928. Coffee and tea, these things are diuretics, people still say. Oh, drink water in the form of water if you want to hydrate. Everything else, you're just going to pee more than you drink. Now, I understand why people think this today, because you wake up in the morning, most people, a great many people wake up in the morning, and what's the first thing they drink of the day? Coffee, right? They pour their couple of cups of coffee, and then shortly after, they're finding themselves peeing. It's like, man, I drank that coffee, and it's like, I'm up peeing. Like I peed, drank coffee, and peed again. And so this coffee really gets my urine, moving. Like, okay, but if you drank anything else in the place of coffee, you would be peeing too, because you get a bunch of fluid, right? And then you get like hypervolemic, and you have to reduce that volume a little bit. It's homeostasis. And so on mornings when people don't drink coffee, they don't just fill up their mug with like a huge thing of like warm water. They pee just as much if they did that, but they it's coffee or nothing. On days where they don't drink anything, they don't pee. On days where they drink coffee, they are the toilet. I'm reading the chat box. People need to hydrate with water first thing in the mornings. So yeah, it's just hydration. If you drink fluids, now if the amount of solute in there is, I mean, it's like goopy, okay, that's not going to be very hydrating, right? I mean, if your Jello does not hydrate you that effectively, uh does but like whole milk is like, it's not goopy, but it's pretty thick, and totally it's wonderful for its hydration, right? I mean, just look at, let's go to the next slide. Look at milk over here. That's better than still water. That is significantly better than still water. So they had these 72. Everyone was male, and so um sorry ladies, this study was, we can call it a sexist study or whatever, but yeah, we all have kidneys and nephrons and bladders, and so what was found in this study can be reasonably relativized, generalized to lady folk. But have people drink a set amount of these things, 1 liter of whatever this, any of these things, and how much is on board 4 hours later. 4 hours later, how much of this do we keep? Or 2 hours. I think it was 4 hours of holding. Urine output is collected for the subsequent 4 hours. So, how much are we peeing? How much are we retaining? We're not. I mean, you can retain a bunch of lager, right? So, what are we talking about? Coffee was actually a little bit worse than lager, but it's not statistically different from still water. So, have your coffee. It's totally fine. This is one of Armstrong's studies. Remember, this was the one where over 11 days really controlled caffeine levels and just measured everything. So, on these days we're within normal clinical ranges. What was unchanged? What did caffeine not affect? Body mass, urine osmolality, urine specific gravity, urine color, 24-hour urine volume, 24-hour sodium and potassium excretion, 24-hour creatinine, blood urea nitrogen, serum sodium potassium, serum osmolality, hematocrit, and total plasma protein. What are people talking about? I mean, they really controlled this, did it over 11 days, and looked for like every possible indicator of kidney or just urine and like blood and urine. Nothing. There's just like nothing, and yet people still have their coffee's going to make you pee. Fluid is going to make you pee. Fluid is a diuretic, sure, but like you're going to hydrate off of it. So again, when we start looking at some of these position stands, position statements, these summations of literature, it just doesn't support caffeine being a diuretic. Feel free to hydrate on it. Is water wonderful? Yes, water is wonderful. Drink a bunch of water. Very healthful, wonderful for the kidneys. Um, can you drink a bunch of coffee and tea and hydrate? Yep, you can do that too. Okay, let's move into cramps. We'll finish off with cramps. Shouldn't take us too long, but let's take a look at what cramping looks like. The guy's not feeling feeling well. Got some labored breathing in there. So, what people think is causing this? what people we don't need to keep going. What people think is the culprit here, what gets blamed, and what people say the remedy is going to be is usually a banana, but what people are suggesting we do to resolve these cramps is a bunch of electrolytes and hydration, stuff like this. And this is old. So it's like this is Eddie and Downs era. I mean, it's 100 years ago, when people are reporting all these anecdotes of, well, I was sweating and then I was cramping, or I was dehydrated, my electrolytes are off, and so this idea of coffee's a diuretic, like, okay, Eddie and Downs, like, this is where we've come along nearly a century since then. Why has your understanding of the thermal and kind of hydrational world not been updated? I mean, everything else about your life, and you're using like the internet, and yet you're still relying on 1920s, on like jazz age science. Same thing with cramps. People tend to cling to their jazz age. Um, but the cramps are common, right? Everyone has cramps. I mean, so when you see these lifetime incidents, these what people are reporting, the prevalence and the incidence of cramping, like, oh, as many as half of marathon runners have reported uh, cramping, and I don't, everyone experiences cramping. I mean, you can reasonably say 100%, but the severe cramping where people are actually reporting this as a real symptom, a sort of I couldn't go on stuff, it gets pretty high. When you get more intense, get into a triathlon, the level of intensity, and especially more intense triathlon. So if you're just looking at 2/3 of people the triathlon competitors are having cramps. So that's more than just the run, right? Let's get a little bit more intense in our stuff, and we're going to have more cramps. But let's get into an Ironman. Let's get some serious distance stuff, and it's more intense. You're seeing more and more cramping. Now, it's not just in, running. It's not just cycling where you're seeing this in lots of sports, right? There's rugby. Again, you see the cycling and marathon and triathlon and stuff are very high, but even rugby is there's an endurance component much more than football. There's an endurance component to rugby, but cramping, lots of people are doing it. Tons of mechanisms get blamed. We'll talk about some of them in the next few minutes, but electrolytes, that's really the big culprit. I mean, let's go back to the 30s and talk about electrolytes, and that's really the big culprit. It gives us something to market. Okay, here's your anti-cramp capsule, right? Just give me like three simple payments of 33.99 or something. And when there's an economy, that's usually where a lot of advice comes from. Oh, you need this recovery drink, you need this recovery compound. This is going to help you, whether it's Gatorade or it's infinite um, alternatives. Bananas are, I mean, that's what people say. Like, oh, you eat your banana, you get your potassium in, you're cramping. We're going to stop that cramp in a hurry if you're getting your potassium in. Now, lots of fruits and vegetables. I mean, go eat a kiwi, eat a potato, something like that. I mean, you can get more potassium than your banana. But again, what we're talking about is electrolytes. Like, oh, you need electrolytes, and often this is a tempting narrative. This is something that a lot of people. It's so easy to believe the simple, intuitive story, right? Well, muscle contraction and regulation involves a bunch of sodium, potassium, and you exercise, you sweat out, you lose some of this stuff, you start cramping in that situation. So let's put it back. That's like blaming lactic acid for muscle burning, though. Nothing could be further from the truth. Lactic acid, muscle burning, does that have anything to do with each other? Technically, yeah. Lactic acid delays the onset of um, metabolic acidosis. It delays the onset of hydrogen ion accumulation. It helps that lactate, what your byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis is going to limit muscle burning. It's going to be a combatant to muscle burning. But everyone's, oh, lactic acid and muscle burn. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, yeah, it's counterintuitive, but the story of lactate causing muscle burning or tryptophan causing that post Thanksgiving lethargic syndrome. They're simple narratives. Yeah, is tryptophan a precursor to serotonin metabolism? That's how you get your serotonin in the brain. Is serotonin in the brain going to make you sleepy? Sure. Is eating tryptophan? Oh, the turkey has tryptophan in it. Is that the simplest story you could possibly tell? Yes. Is it ridiculously false? Yes. And it's the same thing when you start seeing a lot of these very intuitive explanations of cramping. The most intuitive story is usually going to be wrong. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes intuitive physiology is true physiology. Most often, in my experience, it's just not true. So, there's a lot of causes. This is Tim Noakes is a senior author on this paper, but Tim Noakes is one of the most famous authors on the subject of human performance, aerobic performance, not anaerobic weightlifting, anything like that, but aerobic performance and kind of thermal regulation therein. He's one of the big names, and this is a really good paper. It's a little bit old, really good paper though. I'm talking about there's a number of congenital abnormalities that can predispose us to cramping. And that's not what we're talking about here. Yes, there are congenital things, metabolic abnormalities, and there's acquired medical illnesses, whether it's like thyroid disease, diabetes can be associated. Um, Maybe you're wasted when you're running or you're on some beta agonists or there's a number of things that can contribute, but cramping that we just extend all of us are going to experience during times of high exertion, uh, that's different. That's just normal physiology that is misbehaving a little bit. That's not following instructions. And There are multiple kinds of cramping though. So there's the night cramps and not that nocturnal night cramps. People wake up in the night and their calves are cramping. That's different from those exertional cramps, that exercise associated or exertional muscle cramps. And heat is often going to play into this one as well. Pregnancy associated cramps. There are different causes in some of these things, and it's so much easier to test exertional or exercise associated muscle cramps because you just have people exercise a bunch, put people in different environmental conditions, or when people start cramping in a marathon. Oh, let's test you right now. And you can test these things for like those sporadic, infrequent night, those nocturnal, those night cramps where you wake up. Where's the research? The researcher isn't watching you sleep every night. I mean, that'd be weird. And so there's sort of less evidence on some of these other forms of cramps, but more evidence on the muscle cramps that are associated with activity. Now, what are potential causes? What's some stuff that could contribute, that could cause, that we could justifiably blame for cramps? Well, ATP availability. ATP, the energy currency of the body. You're going to hydrolyze your ATP. You're going to ATP hydrolysis, right? Use ATP ACE and you chop off a phosphate and you're getting your energy. And as you deplete your ATP levels, you need ATP for things. Now, in cross bridge cycling, sliding filament theory or cross bridge cycling, you have that interaction, right? The cross bridges, that interaction between actin and myosin. Myosin binds to those myosin binding sites on actin, but there's two different states. There's a strong bond and a weak bond. If ATP is bound there, you're going to have a weak bond. If ATP or if ADP rather and a phosphate are both bound, you have a weak bond. You need a strong bond to actually do the power stroke, to go through the slide of sliding filament theory, to do the cycling of cross bridge cycling, to actually move, to do sliding filament. Those filaments, right, are actin and myosin. And for those to slide, you need the power stroke. To do the power stroke, you need a strong bond between actin and myosin. To do that, you release the phosphate. So ATP hydrolysis, you hydrolyze, you lyse your ATP, chop off a phosphate, and then you release that phosphate, and now you have a strong bond. Just ADP is bound. Then as you do the power stroke, you release the ADP. Now nothing is bound, right? Nothing is bound there. That's still a strong bond. You've completed a power stroke. The myosin kind of head and neck are in their flexed position, and you still have a strong bond. To release, to detach, to get that myosin head off of the binding site on actin, you need to transition back to a weak bond. And then they can detach, they can separate. You can begin your cycle of cross-bridge cycling. How do you do that? You attach a new ATP. As soon as you attach a new ATP, you transition into a weak bond state and you can detach and hydrolyze it and keep doing your stuff. If you're low on ATP, you can find yourself in a you can alter the time course of cross-bridge cycling, but this is unlikely to be a real variable when we're looking at cramping. Now, a couple of things that are going to mess up cross-bridge cycling are going to be a ton of phosphates. If you accumulate a ton of phosphates, you don't do a very good job of releasing the phosphate, right? You need to release that phosphate to transition into a strong bond. And if you have a ton of ADP, you don't do a very good job of releasing your ADP And you need to do that to transition back to a weak bond so that you can attach a new ATP. You're not going to attach an ATP when an ADP is still attached. So those two things can mess up the time course of cross-bridge cycling. You can see it in experiments. You do see the effect of those things in experiments, but you don't really get that low in ATP in an individual muscle cell that's like a big meaty type 2 muscle. You're going at maximum exertion looking at a type 2. You can get it down to 20% of its resting ATP levels, but at the whole muscle, the level of the whole muscle, you're looking at about only about a 20% decrease in the total amount of ATP. You're regenerating it pretty quickly. Isolated type 2 muscles, you can get it down to about 20% of its resting value. But in none of these situations are you really gonna see that effect would not manifest as a cramp, right? That rigor, think like rigor mortis, like that sort of dead hard muscle that's just in a permanently flexed state. Like, okay, that rigor, if you don't have ATP to bind to transition into a weak bond state, that's not really what cramping looks like, though. So the ATP availability, while it's a clean uh, explanation, it's an intuitive one. It doesn't really. That's not what it would look like on a EMG, and that's not really what it would the presentation of cramping. It's not really what it looks like from a physiological perspective. That's not really how it works when you're looking at values of things. It's more about phosphates and ADP that you accumulate as opposed to ATP that you deplete. And so you would end up seeing this time course of cross-bridge cycling being super messed up before you ever saw some sort of like, rigor-induced cramp. Motor end plate functioning, yeah, okay. So you need acetylcholine to cross that neuromuscular junction, right? We're going to depolarize the motor end plate, the sarcolemma, the muscle side of that junction. And then you send the electrical signal into the muscle, right? It goes down the T tubules, finds itself a ryanodine receptor, a dihydropyridine receptor, rather. The dihydropyridine receptor changes shape and opens up the ryanodine receptor, and you get calcium out. So you need acetylcholine to transition that electrical activity into the inside of the muscle. And maybe you can have um, a persistent acetylcholine stimulation. That's what sarin gas does, nerve gas, right? So that nerve gas, sarin, S-A-R-I-N, sarin gas, that's going to stop acetylcholinesterase. It's a acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, which means you don't break down your acetylcholine. Okay, there's something similar to cramping there. Maybe there's a little bit of acetylcholine issue that could go on. That's one explanation. Um, Spontaneous depolarization, or there's a ton of names for this. Armadillo syndrome is my favorite name, but when we're looking at this persistent muscle contraction, maybe there's something here. I don't know. There could be. Let's start in the primary motor cortex and just get some misbehavior of the alpha motor nerves. Maybe there's something going on there, right? So the primary motor cortex, alpha motor nerve, voluntary muscle stimulation. Maybe there's some dysfunction there. That's a possible explanation. Resting membrane potential, if that gets a little bit messy. Now we see this in nociceptors all the time. A great explanation of chronic pain is we have nociceptors, pain nerves, which just have their resting membrane potential chronically affected by an inflammatory environment. And so either they're just constantly firing, or it's just so easy to fire these things. And the nerves themselves create this environment, what's called neurogenic inflammation. Nerves release stuff, CGRP, calcitonin gene related peptides, substance P. But it just creates this environment in which the nerves are eager to depolarize. right? Their resting membrane potential is just teetering on firing. And so maybe we can get on the motor end, not the afferent end, not nociceptor or A alpha, A beta, which would be more proprioceptive and touch and stuff like that, those types of nerves. But so those afferents, let's get on the efferent end. Let's get on the motor end. And is this possible? Maybe. Yeah, maybe something like that is going on. The resting membrane potential. So there were some early studies, 1925. Again, we're in the jazz age where a lot of people still cling to their physiological roots, whether it's coffee as a diuretic and whatever. Um, but people say, like, let's sodium, we can decrease cramping symptoms with just give people some salt, right? Just throw some table salt in your mouth, and we can decrease the cramping symptoms. But if you look at the hyponatremic, your low sodium, right? A hyponatremic state, that means you're really low sodium. You look at people who have illness induced, these conditions that induce this, and you don't see frequency of cramping, risk of cramping, severity. You don't see differences in cramping, whether it's congestive heart failure, uremia, urea. We talked about that. It's in your sweat. It's in your urine. CO with a couple of NH2s on it. Your kidneys should be filtering out a lot of this stuff. If your kidneys are terrible at filtering this stuff, you're not going to sweat enough out and you get uremia. And so all of these, Addison's disease, that's a uh, absence of cortisol. So Cushing's would be an enormous amount of cortisol. Addison's is like you don't have cortisol. Your adrenal glands, what sits atop the kidneys, your adrenal glands have just given up in life. But you see all of these things that are going to cause these electrolyte imbalances, and do they cause cramps? Well, no, that's not what we see. The best evidence that hydration and electrolyte levels are just unrelated to cramping. Now, if there's some extreme departure from homeostasis and you're worried about survival and stuff, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the levels of electrolytes that people find themselves in when competing in endurance events, and they haven't been eating bananas, or they have been eating bananas. Let's compare the two groups. Or they competing in a hot endurance environment, and they're dehydrated as compared to well hydrated. Comparing these different populations, that's these are the populations who are at risk of cramping. Let's evaluate their electrolyte levels, the people who do and don't cramp. So take a bunch of marathon runners and before and after the race, and just test a bunch of people's electrolyte levels. Some people cramp, some people don't. Take a comparison. Is it different? No. Right, you don't find differences in electrolyte levels between marathon runners who do and don't cramp. Let's look at ultra marathon runners. Let's go even farther in the distance. Let's cover some more mileage and look at sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, pre-race, post-race, post-recovery, between crampers and non-crampers. Is there a difference in any of those things? No. The people who are cramping do not have differences in electrolytes. Eat all the bananas you want, and nothing's changing here, right? The culprit, if any of these is somehow culpable, it's not showing up in any of the studies, study after study, and blood volume and plasma volume, or if you really want to know somebody's hydration, um, blood volume, plasma volume, these aren't kind of cramping agents either. So you get dehydrated, um, and the sort of tonicity of your blood. All of these things that people have been blaming since the jazz age, we have really discarded. Not in back then, but I mean, you get like into the 80s, and people are saying, nah, this isn't real. We thought this was true when Great Gatsby was a big deal. Actually, it's a much bigger deal now. When This Side of Paradise was a big deal. That was like Fitzgerald's big book, and then he sort of like fell off the map after that. This Side of Paradise was this, great literary achievement, and that's when we thought all of this, cramping stuff was true. But now that it's the well advanced 1980s, we get to discard these things from common advice, from scientific understanding, from our perceptions of human physiology and functioning. Did we discard it from coaching science? No, you still hear this stuff all the time, but we discarded it. I mean, literally in the 80s, we started saying there's like nothing going on here. Now, what's much more likely to be a culprit is going to be muscle fatigue first. You induce muscle fatigue, that happens first. Remember, we're seeing half of these marathon runners and soccer players, and even more if you're doing triathlons, and there's half of rugby players. Exercise, what are all these people, what do they have in common? They're exerting themselves, and they exert for a while before the cramps come in. You don't cramp 3 minutes into the event. If you do, there's something weird going on. You're cramping after the advent of fatigue. You have sort of worn yourself out, and that's when you start cramping. And so the reflex arcs, if you remember from sort of elementary physiology, sort of basic exercise physiology, the reflex arcs, you have sensors in the periphery. Now, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organ, these things that are going to send afferents up to the spine, sensory information aboard afferent nerves up to the spine. It's not going to send it all the way to the brain, because then you'd have to make an executive decision using your head, and that takes time. It takes a tiny bit of time for nerve conduction velocity. It takes even more time to sort of crunch the numbers and make a conscious decision. That takes a bunch of time. So what you do is you send information up to your spine, and then there's a interneuron in your spine that just sends the information right back out. So like you touch a hot thing and you like recoil your hand, and before you realize like, oh shit, that's hot. You've already recoiled your hand. You step on your tack, and you kind of like your leg shoots in the air like off of the sharp thing, before your brain acknowledges any pain. The pain sets in like a second later, but you've already kind of lifted that executive decision has already been signed into action. And so these are just spinal reflexes. Now, in skeletal muscle, we have muscle spindles, which in response to a stretch, especially a loaded stretch, something where there's a weight load on it, and especially you're stretching fast. When a tissue is stretching, is being elongated rapidly, and when loaded, you're going to send that afferent, that sensory information, up to the spine. It enters the dorsal root to the back of the spine and hits an interneuron, which then activates what's called a gamma motor nerve, little tiny motor nerve, a gamma motor nerve, an alpha motor nerve. Those are those big, meaty ones. I mean, like, can be like 100 microns in diameter, big, meaty, uh, from your primary motor cortex, like a BET cell, BETZ. These huge corridors of nerves come from your brain. Like those gamma motor nerves, just little tiny things that come out of your spine, and they activate what's called intrafusal muscle fibers, little muscle spindles. You get this automatic flex. Now, we all know, you're sitting there at the doctor's office. Maybe ATs do it, PTs might do it. I don't know, whatever. And you do that, like the knee jerk response. That's a muscle spindle response. There's a quick stretch and an immediate flex. You don't flex on purpose. You don't see the little tiny triangle hammer come for you and go, oh, I better flex my quads. You don't do that. You just automatically do it. That's muscle spindles doing that contraction. That's a spinal reflex arc. There's nothing conscious about it. It's just this unconscious process your body's going to do, just like you're not in control of making red blood cells. You're like, oh, let me see if I can secrete some insulin or glucagon, or oh, let me get some growth hormone going. You don't do that consciously. This is all your body does. Nearly everything ever that will ever happen to you in your body and your experiences, there's just like unconscious processing of your body. Consciousness is remarkably has little contribution to your life. You just sort of notice what is happening. That's really all consciousness is. You just observe what just happened to you. Um, and so these reflex arcs, you're not in control of these. The other one is the Golgi tendon organ, which is as you get a big load, as your tissue gets really loaded, you send an afferent. You send sensory information up to the spine. Again, enters the dorsal root. The motor stuff is going to come out of the ventral, the front. Sensory is going to come into the back, the dorsal. Um, and so this information comes up and hits the interneuron. It's an inhibitory interneuron that hyperpolarizes the alpha motor nerves. Hyperpolarizes, which means makes it like impossible to recruit this thing. Makes it way harder to recruit this thing. So you drop the weight. So if you've ever done skull crushers, lying tricep extensions or whatever, and like suddenly that bar just collapses on you, or you're lifting something and the weight just falls. That's Golgi tendon organ saying, nope, no thanks, right? You are hyperpolarizing, you are deactivating an alpha motor nerve, those motor nerves that live up in your, like on the headphones. If any of you are wearing like my style headphones, that's like where your primary motor cortex lives. Is sort of underneath the headphone um, strap, the rainbow underneath the arch of the headphones. And so you're hyperpolarizing your alpha motor nerves with a Golgi tendon organ. So these spinal reflexes, the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle, this really seems to be what's going on with muscle cramping, where um, the muscle spindle response gets increased. There's a muscle spindle response that's increased where you're stimulating contraction. There's a Golgi tendon organ response that's decreased. So the Golgi tendon organ is an inhibition. And so you get fatigued. That's step one. And what step two is inhibition is withdrawn and sort of promotion of muscle spindle activity is activated. That seems to be largely agreed on in the literature as the real culprit. And the cures for stretching would be cures for this particular, the cures, I'm sorry, for cramping. Whether it's like flex the opposite, some reciprocal inhibition phenomenon, but is usually contributing a lot to the stretching of the agonist that is cramping. So if it's your gastroc soleus, something like your gastroc's cramping, all right, how are you going to relieve that? Well, stretch out the gastroc, and if you're flexing your tib anterior, that's the same thing as stretching your gastroc. So, but what you're looking at is having an effect on the exact same things that would cure um, this particular, the Golgi tendon organ, muscle spindle, reflex arc response. That's what you're addressing when you do that. And it's really the only cure for cramping. That's going to work. Oh, you're a banana. Okay, I'll eat my banana and just keep cramping in agony, or I can just stretch this shit out. And address the real problem that has nothing to do with electrolytes. That has more to do with abnormal spinal reflexes, fatigue followed by abnormal spinal reflexes. That really seems to be the culprit here. Now, just because electrolytes and hydration seem to bear little effect on incidence and severity of cramping, that doesn't mean they're not valuable. That doesn't mean go ahead and stop eating electrolytes as a part of your sports drink, right? Quotation sports drink. Keep them in there. That's good. You need that stuff. Hydration is most important. right? Hydration is most important because really what you're losing more of is water, fluid, and you got to replace that thing. Get your extracellular compartment well hydrated. You got to keep that blood volume uh, kind of full, but you still have to incorporate these things. It's just not really critical or particularly relevant to cramping. Now, there's a lot of population differences getting beyond cramping, but everybody is susceptible to heat illness. I don't care where you were born. I mean, you're like, you're born in Saudi Arabia, and it's like your entire life has been 100 million degrees. Okay, you're still susceptible to heat illness. You're never immune. You're not like inoculated against it. You're still susceptible, but your adaptation is probably pronounced. You are much less susceptible to heat illness, heat exhaustion, heat syncope, heat cramps, um, heat stroke. You are less susceptible. You have those adaptations in place. But there's always going to be responders and non-responders. Go visit a region, and some people respond well, some people don't. Watch people who take creatine. Some people like, man, my bench press went up like 40 pounds, and other people like, what are you talking? Nothing happened. This is like a placebo. There are responders and non-responders to everything, especially when you start looking at exercise, or some people are every drug. Here's a pain reliever. No, that didn't work. Let's try something else. Find somebody. I mean, this is probably the most frustrating uh, phenomenon that you'll see is seizures. How do you cure seizures? Well, I don't know, go on like a ketogenic diet. That tends to work. But how do you cure it with drugs? There's this whole series. You find somebody who's having seizures, and the drugs they go through. Oh, let's try Depakote. Did that work? No, I just gained like 20 pounds, and I hate it. But I had just as many seizures. Like, okay, let's try something else. The responders and non-responders, and you're going to find that for pretty much any condition, and you're going to find it for any environmental adaptation as well. Now, kids, old people, you have to be a little bit cautious. Old people don't sweat well. Old people, they're bad sweaters. And so they're going to dissipate heat poorly, which means now their metabolism probably sucks too. They're probably not generating that much heat. You take a 66-year-old compared to a 23-year-old, and the metabolic generation of heat is going to be very different. That's why um, if you're old on the West Coast, let's say you're like Pacific Northwest, you move down to California or Arizona when you're 70, you're retired and whatever, and because you're just not generating that much heat, you're cold all the time. Oh, it feels good to have the temperature beat horrible. And let's say you live in New England, right? You're I don't know, Vermont or Connecticut, or let's say you're like New York or whatever. You're like East Coast. Where do you go? You go down to Florida when you get old to retire, because you suck at producing your own heat at that point. And so you have to consider this. If you're working with populations, older people don't generate heat, but they dissipate it pretty shittily too, because they're bad sweaters. Now, little kids, you take a little child, and their heat acquisition is going to be fast, right? They don't have that much body mass, right? An elephant is going to take a long time to absorb a climate. I mean, a little tiny lizard can go to Orlando and just watch all the little lizards lying out on the concrete, just getting hot, right? All the tiny little bodies, they can absorb, they can transition their heat very effectively. Elephants are gonna take forever. And then the surface area to mass ratio, right? I mean, this is where I was talking about Hulk, the Incredible Hulk. The more muscle you have, you're not getting that much additional surface area for dissipation, for evaporation, for convection, for all of these. You don't have that much surface area with a bunch of muscle. More surface area is helpful to dissipate heat. This is where I was talking about elderly populations, right? So they also get a decreased blood flow to the skin. So old people dissipate heat badly. That's why you see these heat waves. I mean, you'll see it in Stockton. You'll see it in all the places where old people retire. Arizona and California and Florida. So where old people go to live out their years as blizzards, accumulating heat. Those heat waves. I mean, like, when the Chicago heat wave, go back to the 90s, the Chicago heat wave, who's really dying here? Older people tend to be disproportionately affected by these things. So heat acclimation or acclimatization, you're out in the world's climate. Acclimation, classically, you can think of, they're sort of used interchangeably, but you can think of these words, if you want to differentiate them. Acclimation is more of a laboratory adaptation, where acclimatization is nature's climates are doing it to you. Earlier onset of sweating. You go, you train in the heat for a while. Go adapt. Sweating is going to happen sooner and sooner and sooner. You will have more total sweat. You will be a sweatier beast. So if you see somebody who's just really sweaty, they're probably not out of shape. I mean, unless it's like both of you just walked up a flight of stairs and one person's all out of breath and they have like that ring of chest sweat and the other person's like jumping around and ready to keep going. Okay, there are gradations here of there's context of what I'm talking about, but earlier onset of sweating and more total sweat at the same temperature. These are more fit people. Take a soccer player and look at their sweat. Soccer players, they sweat well. Soccer players are sweatier, and that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. That means they're fit to thermal punishment. Um, Aldosterone adaptation, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the dilute secretion, what this means is, let's retain some of our electrolytes and just start spitting out some pure water. So the most fit among you, if we were to do the lick test and say, how salty is this, you could tell who's the most fit sweater by, can I is this like a sauce? Is it like a seasoning that I would dip fries in or something? Or is this just like warm water that when people say, like Stephanie, like your family, when like you should drink warm water, is that like a Stephanie beverage, or is that like a dipping sauce? Like, you can compare athleticism by how dilute the how diluted the secretions are. Reduced heart rate at a given intensity. Now, some of this is if you can ward off um, the the hypovolemia, that cardiac drift consequent of that. If you can ward this stuff off, you'll see the maintenance of a heart rate a little bit better, and better distribution of blood to the skin. And ideally, the temperature where you are is going to be colder. It's not going to be 37 degrees Celsius outside. That way, if you're taking blood to the skin, it's not just accumulating the temperature that's outside. A lot of this, it's just a couple of weeks within the first exposure. If you're out there exercising every day, you go out and you're exercising, you're subjecting. I mean, don't go out and have a heat stroke every day, but go out and subject yourself to exercise and stress in the heat every day, and a couple of weeks, and you're gonna have. I mean, you can still continue to improve, but you get the bulk of your adaptation is kind of in a hurry. It happens. It happens pretty quickly. Um, and so just go, like, if you're going to you have a tournament that you're going to be doing in Baghdad or something, like, oh, my next soccer tournament is there. I think the World Cup is famous for this, of where is it going to be? Is it what are the weather conditions? How do we train for these weather conditions? But if you're training for the weather conditions is like, lethargic stuff, you're sun tanning, that doesn't help you. That never helps, right? That's just like your body is, maybe you're, you know, sweating out the toxins or whatever. You're not adapting. You're not adapting to performance in the heat, where all of those adaptations are setting into your physiology. That stuff's not going to happen. So then you start looking at how to orient practice, right? How to structure. Let's say it's football. It's like American football. You're all helmeted, or these big thick uniforms. You're trapping in all this heat. The sweat, where is that supposed to evaporate? There's no convection here. I mean, it starts to get pretty dehydrating, and the thermal load gets pretty high. And so there starts to be advice of like, okay, we're pretty early here. Helmets only, and then let's after a couple of days we can get into some helmets and shoulder pads. Practices 6 to 14. We can look at some getting some thicker uniforms on here, but don't just leap into full practice, full uniform, unless you want to have lawsuits on your hands because you killed people, right? That's the Corey Stringer Institute. Um, that's at UConn. Doug Casa is the one who runs that. But it's a bunch of thermal load research, and all the research is on essentially heat strokes, of looking at that. So let's stop there. Oh, it's like on time. I was thinking we're going to end early. Do, do we have questions? Stephanie, I hope you don't mind me using your familial uh, rehydration solution advice.
It's all good.
Okay. I'll get this stuff uploaded so you can rewatch them. Any questions for today, or are you just eager to shut down brains?
Dr. Jensen, are we going to have all day to do the test or just during class time?
How about the test will start during class? Does anybody have something pressing after class? Or is everybody okay to stick around after class? If I say like you have 2 hours to do the test, I mean, I'm not going to make it 2 hours long, but it's grad school. What I want is for people as you're doing to be curious and learn stuff, and not to have this class be an overwhelming assault on your free time. What I want is like, let's talk about some cool physiology, and I'll hold you accountable for learning stuff. I don't want it to be a drain on your schedule. So uh, it's not going to be like the hardest thing you've ever taken. I'll make it where it's like an hour long test where I would say this will probably take an hour, and I'll give you 2 hours to do it, something like that. If we start at the normal class time, we start at 2 o'clock, and I say you have until 4. Is that okay? I'm reading the comments. Would you be able to open up the test a little earlier than the start of class, like 1 p.m. instead of 2? Sure. Yeah. I have another class before this, but I just do like office hours for that class, and I'll probably be there, but it doesn't, I mean, you guys are grad students. It's not like I need to monitor what you're doing. So yeah, I can open it up earlier. So how about like, I don't know, 1, fine, 1 o'clock. Yeah, I'll open it up at 1. That's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just, 1 to 3:30. I don't know, something like that. 1:15 to 3:15 or something. Ricky, we haven't decided on the date of the test. If it's going to be, I think it's March 5th is the last Friday before spring break, or I think it was March 15th would be the first Monday when we return. Maybe it's been decided on Canvas, and I haven't looked. I just posted that thing. Since in the syllabus it says Friday, March 5th, that's sort of our staple, and we have to have a more than a majority vote to overturn it, because that's what I don't want people to like, well, you said in the syllabus. Like, okay, I want that, like a compelling majority to overturn that. But I'm happy to yield to what everybody wants. To do the cold, we're now officially done. Heat over. We're done with heat. I'll get these uploaded, and I will do the first cold lecture, I will retain the review slides for heat. And so because there's going to be a few new review slides for what we talked about today, the cramping and stuff like that. I'll retain those slides for the first cold lecture, and then I'm going to restart the review slides where it's just cold after that. And then I'll make a all review slide. And if you want to go through that together, just let me know what you guys want to do. We'll do the test after cold, right? So we just finished heat, and we'll do cold next. We'll do the test after that. But if you want to do the test on Friday or the next Monday, and you want to do this coming Friday as a review session, something like that, just let me know. I'm happy to cater. Okay, Alexis, will you put that review session Friday? Will you put that in the Canvas announcement? I don't know if people have posted there yet. I just haven't gone and checked. But that's why I just want to look at one central place where everybody voices their opinion. And I hope people feel comfortable to voice your opinion. Not like, oh, I don't want to say this because I think everybody else wants this. Just say it. Everybody just needs to say what they want in life, whether it's in a family, it's in a relationship, it's at a work site, it's in whatever. You just got to say what you want, and that's the best way of getting it. So just put that whatever you want post on Canvas, and I will honor. I'll do my best to honor. All right, let's get out of here. See you guys on Friday.